My name is Ryley, and you are listening to the Ryley Heppner podcast. Well, Tom, I'm always really interested to know from biblical scholars just how they even got to where they are. Could you describe your journey into scholarship a little bit? Whether there are some defining moments that led to a career of just studying and teaching the scriptures on such a deep and scholarly level?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's nothing dramatic really. I grew up as a Catholic and I wasn't a believer. I grew up in Salem, Oregon,
Okay.
and so I became a believer when I was 17, and then I felt called to ministry, and it was the 1970s. So I felt like, well, I need to go to seminary to study. I wanted to be a pastor. And essentially, after I was a believer, we mainly worked with youth. And I'm studying and I'm doing really well in school. And maybe it was two things. One, I, I'd heard pastors did a lot of administration, which I don't think is totally accurate, but that's what I heard. And secondly, when I finished my MDiv and THM, I was 26, and I said to my wife, I think I'm too young to be a pastor. And I'm doing well in school, and I think no matter what I do, I would like to get a PhD. And so she agreed. So I went off and got my PhD at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena. And then when I finished there, we had a child, one child, our first child, and I said to her, I need a job. Whatever comes first, church or academia, I'll take.
Okay.
Uh, and I got an academic job. I got a job at Azusa Pacific. I really didn't have a strong desire at that point to write. I just because honestly I was just looking for a job, a ministry job. I thought I'd enjoy both of them. But then, what happened to me is kind of slowly, as I taught, I got more and more interested in writing. So it just slowly came upon me. And so, yeah. And then once I started writing, I thought, man, I really love doing this. I love researching. I love writing. And all of us who do it, we always think it's hard to find time.
Sure.
Uh, I mean, I'm teaching right now and everything always seems very pressed. So.
Did it feel you kind of just fell into it to some degree? Did you feel like it was a ministry right from the beginning?
Yeah, I
Okay.
did feel that. Yeah, and I've always felt I I mean, I'm not writing scholarly technical monographs. I've
Okay.
always felt, yeah, I'm writing for the church. I'm writing for pastors. I'm writing for students. I'm writing for uh, those who I hope can use my writings in helpful ways in their ministries. Yeah.
Well, you've done that really well. I mean, I've benefited in ministry from your writings for ages. I didn't know that you had a that desire or focus to write to the church specifically, but I'm thankful for scholars that have that bent. Because if it's all just written to scholars, there would be, I think, a greater chasm between the church and scholarship. Uh,
Yeah,
yeah.
we need people who do the technical work. That's helpful. And then we need people who will bridge it to
Hmm.
the next generation. So we all have different callings.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, within that, what first drew you to your study of Paul and specifically the book of Galatians? I know you've written a bit on Galatians before this, probably taught on it. Was there something in this journey into New Testament scholarship that sparked your interest in Pauline studies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's autobiographical, honestly, growing up as a Catholic. Not that I was terribly concerned about it as a young kid, but I believe that you're justified by works. I mean, I never would have used the word justified as a kid, right?
Sure.
So I didn't even know that word. But I think when I became a Christian and read that you were saved by faith, that was very, I'm no Martin Luther, but it was very liberating to me, very freeing. And that was the wonderful good news of the gospel. And so I love the gospels too, but I had a particular draw towards Paul and justification. So I've written a book on faith alone. I've written a book on justification. I have a commentary on Galatians, two editions of commentaries on Romans. I wrote two books on the law. So, and now this book on Galatians. So I've written a lot, on this particular theme. And I think it's because pastorally, it's been very rich to me.
Okay. Yeah, it's ministered to your own soul as you've been studying and writing this.
Exactly. Exactly.
What this book in particular, this series, even New Testament theology, but especially your volume, Christ Crucified: A Theology of Galatians. What was the inspiration there? Was it just that an editor approached you, or that you had this idea that you brought to them?
Well, so this is how the series began. Also wrote the volume in this series on the book of Revelation.
Okay.
That was that was the first book in the series. The genesis of that book is I was writing, and it's out now. I was writing a commentary on Revelation in the Baker exegetical commentary of the New Testament, and I was slated to give lectures at Moore College in Sydney, Australia, and I wanted to turn those lectures into a book, so I did it on the Book of Revelation. So a book called The Joy of Hearing. So when I turned in that book, Justin Taylor of Crossway Publishing, Justin said, "What about doing a series for every book of the New Testament? And why don't you get another editor and we'll do that?" So I contacted my friend Brian Rosner from Australia, who's at Ridley College in Melbourne, and we agreed to do that. And my son Patrick, by the way, wrote a really good volume, I think, on Acts,
Oh, okay.
but in the series. So what happened with Galatians is our contributor on Galatians dropped out, sadly. I
Okay.
think he would have been great. I didn't want to slate myself to write two books in the series.
Sure.
But I consulted with Crossway. I actually had other ideas. I even asked a person or two, I believe, to write it. But it ended up in my bailiwick. And honestly, when it ended up falling to me, I was like, well, yeah, I mean, I'd love to write it. I've spent so much time in Galatians. This will not be a hard book for me to write. But it wasn't a plan, right?
Okay.
It wasn't a plan for me to write this book. It kind of fell into my lap uh, in the series, and but then I loved doing it. It was really fun.
Okay. Oh, very neat. Galatians has been called, I think, by the reformers, even the Magna Carta of Christian liberty. You've already talked about a little its influence on you in terms of presenting the gospel. What do you think makes Galatians such a crucial book for understanding the gospel?
Yeah, I think it's because Galatians is a letter that's written, we could say, in a fight, right?
Okay.
A battle. You have these teachers coming in from outside to these churches in Galatia, and they're saying, "Hey, you've got to be circumcised." I think they were saying you've got to be circumcised, and you got to keep the law of Moses to truly belong to the people of God. And I think the Galatians were shaken by that. I think they were stunned. I think these teachers read Genesis 17, 9 through 14 to them, which says, circumcision is a eternal covenant, permanent, physical. And so Paul writes in response to that. And I think it speaks to us today because the rawness of what was going on, the vividness of the battle, the emotions Paul feels, the how important this is, it just bleeds through the letter, right? So it has kind of of course it's the word of God, but it has a living, dynamic power. There's a contemporaneity to it that we still feel today, and of course, the message is the most important one in all life. What it, what does it mean to be right with God? I mean, that's worth That's worth getting excited about.
Would you kind of summarize or use that as kind of a thesis of Galatians? What does it look like to be right with God?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. What is it? What's required? I think that's the battle.
Okay.
Do you, do you have to be circumcised and observe the Old Testament law to be right in God's sight? Or is it, as I think Paul would say, through faith? It's not through works of the law, it's through faith in Jesus Christ alone.
How should we understand Paul's polemic against the works of the law and against circumcision? Is he only addressing Jewish legalism, or is there, even at the time of his writing, a broader application of that?
Well, that's a fascinating question because there's been a huge debate on what
Okay.
works of law means. So the new perspective on Paul, I don't know if you've hearers have heard of it, but the new perspective on Paul argues that the works of law are the boundary markers, like circumcision, Sabbath, food laws that separate Jews from Gentiles. Therefore, they argue that Paul is not engaging in a polemic against legalism or works righteousness. But Paul's complaint, according to the new perspective, Paul's complaint with the Jewish teachers is that they're demanding Gentiles become Jews to be saved. So they say Paul's complaint is exclusivism, nationalism, restrictivism, ethnocentrism. But actually, I disagree with that. I hold the reformers' view, I would say, on works of law. I think the works of the law do not focus on the boundary markers, circumcision, Sabbath, food laws. Although I think the boundary markers are included, I think works of law refer to the whole law. And Paul's argument isn't fundamentally, I don't think his argument is fundamentally that Jews are legalistic. So I think his argument is fundamentally justification doesn't come from works of law. Works of law refers to the whole law, and it doesn't come from works of law because you have to keep it all. So Galatians 3:10, for as many as are of works of the law are under a curse, for it is written, cursed is everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law to do them. And I take that verse to say the reason a curse is imposed on those who are works of the law is because you have to keep all the law, right? Notice the word all in that verse. You have to keep all the law to avoid the curse. And of course, no one does that.
Yeah.
So I would argue Paul's fundamental critique is righteousness doesn't come from works of the law, not because of legalism, although I think legalism is a problem, right? But I don't think that's his fundamental critique. Nor do I think his fundamental critique is ethnocentrism, although that's wrong too. And I do think that's an issue, can be an issue. But I think his fundamental critique is no, righteousness can't come through the law, through the works of the law, because of human disobedience. And I think he's saying, look, if you guys put yourself under the law, if you put yourself under the old covenant, well, Galatians 5:3, you're obligated to keep the entire law, and you can't do that.
Yeah.
And you won't do that. So you need Christ, with Galatians 3:13. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. The curse, the curse that lies upon all of us for our disobedience is not removed by our obedience to the law, but by Christ's atoning death. I would say his penal substitutionary death. He took the curse penalty we deserved, and he suffered in our place, taking that curse, and therefore we're free.
Would you say that Judaism pre-Christ was a works-based righteousness?
Yeah, I think that's complicated.
Okay.
I think it
Because
depends.
I asked only because I feel like, especially as preachers, we often make this
Yeah,
separation, like, Christians saved by grace through faith. The Jews were works based, but sometimes I wonder, and even in reading your commentary, if that's completely, if
yeah.
maybe we're doing a disservice to Judaism a little there.
Yeah, I think if we look at the Jewish writings, some some writings incline in that direction, some don't,
Okay.
you know. So I think what we see in Jewish circles is a diversity. But then what I would argue is, look, legalism, now I'm going to define legalism. Legalism is the attempt to earn a right standing with God by our behavior. Look, that's a human problem.
Sure.
We all want to impress God with what we do. Now, the fundamental problem is we still try to do that even though we fall short,
Yeah.
even though we sin. But there is, because some people want to say, look, legalism didn't exist in Judaism. It's not an issue in Paul's letters, but I think it is an issue because I think it's a profoundly human tendency. We want to be commended for what we do.
Hmm.
I mean, another word for that is pride, right? Pride in what? Pride in our achievement. But before God, there's no basis for that. The wonderful thing about the gospel is God humbles us. He shows us our lack, our insufficiency, and then in his great love, he supplies it.
Hmm.
So as long as we're trying to establish our own righteousness, as Paul says in Romans 10, then we won't rejoice in the fact that Christ is our righteousness, that we are now united to Christ through his death and resurrection. And our righteousness doesn't lie in ourselves, but in Jesus Christ crucified and risen. That's that's our righteousness and that's our hope. And legalism tries to say our righteousness lies in ourselves. Finally, we can accomplish it. And so, yeah, did some Jews fall into that? Absolutely, and it's a very natural human tendency.
Yeah, so you would say some fell into it, but not in a way that God set up the Old Testament sacrificial system and the law as a works-based
Right.
system.
No, I would argue, yeah, no, there's no works-based theology per
Okay.
se in the Old Testament. The Old Covenant is a covenant where God graciously redeemed his people and then gave them the law in response to his grace of liberating them and freeing them from Egypt. It's very interesting reading the Ten Commandments, right? I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. That's a paraphrase of Exodus 20, verse 2. Then he gives them the Ten Commandments. Or Exodus 19, he says, I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Then he gives them the commandments. First, he frees them, and then the commands are a response. So what happens though is we can turn that around as human beings. God never gives such a pattern, but we can turn it around where our good deeds become the basis of our right relationship with God.
Yeah.
And Abraham was justified by faith, not by works. So
Do you see
Genesis.
this sometimes though? Do you see us pastors do this in the church where we make the separation go, we're saved by grace, the Jews were going to the law and then Jesus came. Do you see us simplify it like that sometimes?
Sometimes, yeah, yeah. And there's some truth in it, right?
Yeah.
Not the Old Testament, but some Second Temple Jews, I do think fell into a focus on obedience and works that's contrary to the message of the New Testament.
Okay.
But I just don't want to say all,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. I hear you making that definite. Uh, Keeping with the Old Testament, how does Paul, because he uses it a fair bit in Galatians, how does his use of the Old Testament, how does he use the Old Testament to argue for justification by faith? And are there things we can learn from his method of interpreting the Old Testament?
Yeah, well, of course, he focuses on Abraham right in chapter 3, because Abraham, that's instructive. So, what's the first thing I'd say? He's always reading the Bible in terms, I think, of the storyline of Scripture.
Okay.
Abraham's the founder of the Jewish people, right? He's the beginning. And so Paul asked the question, what does Scripture say about how Abraham was right with God? The very founder of the Jewish nation, what what was his relationship with God like? I think Paul asked that question, and he says, of course, he was righteous by faith. not by works, not by works of the law, but by faith. And then he argues, right, the same is true for you. And then, very, very interesting, Galatians 3:10 through 14, the first verses 10, 11, 12, 13, every one of those verses begins with Paul's comment and then an Old Testament citation. So yeah, Paul is grounding. He's grounding his theology of justification in the Old Testament. And he's saying, look, this is the gospel I'm preaching is what the Old Testament teaches as well. And then, I mean, we could go on, but then in the next verses, Galatians 3:15 and following, he argues covenantally. The Abrahamic covenant came first, then the Mosaic covenant. And the Mosaic covenant, the Sinai covenant, the covenant made with Israel at Sinai, that covenant was never intended to be enforced forever. It was always intended to be an interim, temporary covenant. So, we're no longer under that covenant, he argues. So here's one of the big takeaways. We interpret the Bible covenantally.
Hmm.
We recognize what place we are in salvation history. We're not under the Mosaic covenant. We're not Israel. We're not a theocracy. We're the church of Jesus Christ. We live in the age of fulfillment. The Mosaic covenant was good. It was fine for Israel. Paul doesn't criticize the fact that God gave that covenant, but we don't do Old Testament sacrifices. They point to the sacrifice of Jesus, right? So, so yeah, we always read Scripture in light of the whole storyline, in light of the covenants. And two of my colleagues at Southern Seminary wrote a great book on this, Kingdom Through Covenant. Peter Gentry and Steve Wellum, and I think that's a very nice read. Uh, and there's a smaller version of it. I forget how they title it. If you want to read the smaller version, they kind of just turn their title around, God's
Okay.
Kingdom Covenants or something like that. So you can find those on Amazon, and yeah, those are
Do you
good.
think there's something to be learned in how Paul uses Hagar and Sarah, even in terms of allegorizing a little, or
Yeah, yeah. Well, people have different views on this. I think Paul does engage in a different kind of exegesis there. I actually don't think that passage is a justification for allegorizing, but
okay,
it depends on what the word allegory means, right? Um, what Paul means by it, I don't think is what we always mean by it,
okay,
because what we mean by it is allegory. I mean, I think typically an allegory means it has another meaning that is not tied to an author's intent or to a natural reading of the text. So I prefer to say we can argue typologically
okay,
because in typology you have correspondence between persons, right? Adam and Christ, for example, right? Institutions like the Old Testament priesthood, or events like the first Exodus and the second Exodus. So, there's typology, but typology is tied to the Old Testament and to real events in history and is grounded, I think, in the scripture. So I think, yeah, there's a divine author and there's a human author, but I worry about the word allegory because I don't think it's fair to say that uh, with the divine author we can justify arbitrary readings.
sure,
Now, there's a debate on this, but to me, allegory means arbitrary readings, readings sundered from what a text means both in its historical context but also canonically. So I think there's good reasons to read the text canonically, but yeah, not everyone would agree with me here, but I would say not allegorically.
okay. And is it fair to, I don't know, assume a little that Paul's use even of Hagar and Sarah is not a prescription necessarily for how all of us should. I mean, Paul has a special office there as a, as a divinely inspired writer.
Yeah, yeah, and that I think that's true, and but I think we could also say, actually that, and in terms of the story, it fits with what he's doing, right? S- The birth of Isaac is a miracle, right? Produced by God. The birth of Ishmael is Abraham and Sarah's attempt to fulfill the promise by their own wisdom and their own strength. So even there, right, there's a there's a historical core to what he's saying. It's not an arbitrary reading of the Old Testament narrative. He's saying, look, the behavior in both those cases represents two different ways of obtaining the promise. So it isn't like a radically like we don't just read that and think, well, it has nothing to do with that story.
Yeah.
It does fit. And then he draws a correlation. So that's what I think he's doing. I have a student who wrote a dissertation on the word allegory there, and he actually argued it's like a metaphor,
Okay.
right? It's there's a metaphorical relationship between the Sinai covenant and what and Hagar and Ishmael and Sarah and Isaac.
You emphasize in this volume the centrality of the cross in Galatians, rightfully so. Could you say a word about how Paul frames the crucifixion of Christ in its relation to salvation?
Yeah, so I think this is really fascinating because I think the Galatian opponents are saying to enter into the people of God, you must be circumcised. And Paul says, no, the entrance into the people of God is the cross, not circumcision. So he begins the letter this way, right? If you look at the introductions to Paul's letters are usually two verses. In Galatians, it's five. And he never mentions, I think this is right, in any of his other introductions to cross. But here he says now he doesn't use the word cross, but he has the idea, right? He was delivered over, handed over for our sins to deliver. No, he gave himself. That's right, because I'm not looking at the Bible. He gave himself for our sins to deliver us from our present evil age. Well, there it is, because the false teachers are saying to be delivered, you have to be circumcised. And he says, no, that comes from the cross. And then it's just sprinkled all through the letter. If righteousness comes through the law, Galatians 2:21, then Christ died for nothing, right? It's either the law and circumcision or the cross, or chapter 3, verse 1. O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified? And he's like, who cast a spell on you guys? Who bewitched you? Who did Satan's made you forget about the cross, right? And then the text I already quoted, right? Galatians 3:13. How do we remove the curse? Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming cursed for us by hanging on a tree. And then in Galatians 4:4 and 5, he says again, right? God sent his son to redeem us from the curse through the cross. And that what does he say at the end of the letter, right? I only want to boast in the cross instead of circumcision in the law. So it becomes this polarity. It's either circumcision or it's the cross. And Paul's saying it's the cross. It's Christ, right? The cross means Christ. What do you put your hope in? What do you trust in? Not you're If you're looking to circumcision, you're actually trusting in yourself instead of what Jesus has done. And so I think he's saying, you guys, you're in danger of nullifying the cross. That's fundamental to our faith.
You've obviously, I mean, you obviously interact with a lot of people's understandings of Galatians, whether through teaching or writing, preaching. I'm sure you hear what people are saying and how it's being presented. Wonder if you could identify a few of the most common misconceptions about Galatians that you see, hear, run into, interact with.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. I
Or
mean,
are there any maybe that you hear from the pulpit sometimes that you're like,
no, not so much from the
okay,
pulpit. I go to a church, very faithful, great pastor. So yeah, he's always pretty much on target.
Okay.
Um, but I would say the new perspective on Paul, which I already mentioned,
Hmm.
that the new perspective has, I think there's some truth in the new perspective because they emphasize the unity between Jews and Gentiles. But I think one of the weaknesses of the new perspective is that they try to say that many of the Reformation emphases of Luther and Calvin were wrong. And
Okay.
on that, I think they're mistaken. There, I think the more traditional reading of Galatians is correct. So that's a more scholarly view out there. Um,
Maybe on that one though, I'd be curious just about some new perspective implications. How do you think the new perspective on Paul would affect one's reading of Galatians?
well, they would say, it's not fundamentally about yeah, in so many different ways, but it's not fundamentally about uh, responding to those who are trying to be justified by works.
Okay.
So and there I just think they're off-centered from the beginning. And therefore, I think New Perspective readers do not preach the gospel with the same clarity
Okay.
that we see from the reformers and from the Protestant tradition as a whole. So I think that's a great concern. Um, I think maybe, I mean, I don't know, in popular circles, I think perhaps one mistake people could make from Galatians is we're free, and then
Sure.
they don't emphasize the other side of Galatians, which
Hmm.
is by the power of the Spirit, we live in a way that pleases God, not perfectly, of course. But Galatians, right, this after Paul clarifies justification is by faith alone, what does he say in the last part of the letter? Like, walk in the Spirit, and you will not fulfill the desires of the flesh. Um, those who are led by the Spirit are not under the law. I don't think he means by that you're free to sin.
Yeah.
He emphasizes the fruit of the Spirit, right?
Hmm.
Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. He says in 525, march in step with the Spirit. He says in chapter 6, verse 8, sow to the Spirit. So I think one misconception could be, well, Paul doesn't care about how we live.
Hmm.
No, he does care about how we live, but we live that way, again, not in our own strength, but by the power of the Spirit. So I think Paul would argue, look, those who have died and risen with Christ, the power of the Spirit is now unleashed in our lives. Now, we still struggle with sin. I think we still sin every day, but we're new creatures now.
Yeah.
Uh, what does Paul say at the end of the letter? We're a new creation, right? We're not the world is crucified to us, and we're crucified to the world. He says that as well. So the new age has dawned in Jesus. We belong to Jesus, and so we have new life now. So that's maybe I don't know if that's true, but maybe in
Hmm.
some popular circles they emphasize our freedom, but not our freedom, as Paul says, is not an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another.
Yeah.
He said in the letter.
A timely conversation because we're actually preaching through Galatians right now. And this last week I was in chapter 5, 16 to 24. So this is
Mm,
exactly what we were talking
that's
about.
great.
Relatedly, you know, how can believers, you think there's any principles or ways to recognize when they are subtly falling into this kind of legalism, even if it's, at the same time they're intellectually affirming salvation by grace?
Yeah, I think maybe if it's subtle, if we sin, if we really, I mean, obviously, when we sin, we are to repent and we're sorry.
Hmm.
But if we beat ourselves up so much about it and we get so depressed and down and downcast, it could be that we're thinking, I'm better than that, but actually we're not.
Yeah.
we shouldn't be surprised. I mean, there's no excuse ever for sinning, but we're all we all have the potential to sin in radical and shocking ways. That's who we are. So I think that's kind of a subtle trust in ourselves. If we get, really like, oh, I've sinned, I'm so terrible, and we get so disconsolate and
Hmm.
down. I think that could be one indication. Um, I think, and it's so subtle, right? Any form of pride. But pride is we all struggle with pride. I mean, I always quote C.S. Lewis in his great chapter in Mere Christianity titled The Great Sin, which is pride. And Lewis says there, if you don't think you're conceited, you're very conceited indeed,
Yeah.
you know. So, but pride is always a form of works righteousness, right? It's always, I'm great. And because, yeah, we're saved, but we still struggle with sin.
Hmm.
Pride, never admitting we're wrong, saying, in principle, oh yeah, in principle, I know I'm wrong on some things, but we never admit it in real life,
Yeah,
It be
that's a good point.
it becomes theoretical. Yeah, oh, of course I'm wrong on some things, but do we ever say to a person, yeah, I'm wrong, I'm sorry, or is it always we're always right, you
Hmm.
know? And could a friend or a spouse, those who know us well, say, "When's the last time you ever said I'm sorry about something?" That to me, that'd be another sign of subtly trusting in yourself. None of us is that perfect.
Yeah. Those are good. I appreciate that. Uh, Paul seems very intense in Galatians. I mean, calling them foolish. Even, I mean, chapter one saying that those who preach another gospel should be accursed. How do you think pastors, teachers, and even just the average lay person, the person in the pew, how do we balance strong theological conviction with pastoral care?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'd say is like he's strong because life and death are at stake.
Okay.
He He loves the Galatians. He wants them to go to heaven and be with Jesus forever. And he believes that if they go the other way, they won't be saved, right? So that accounts for the strength of his emotions. Of course, we always have to take into account the culture of the day, right? Um, how do we translate those strong words into our culture? And at the same time caring for one another. I mean, I think, I'm actually thinking of First Corinthians. I think Paul does that, right, in his letters. He can be, in First Corinthians, he can be very sarcastic, and then First Corinthians 4, and then turn around. I'm saying this to you because I'm your father, and
Yeah.
I begot you in the gospel. So, in Galatians, right, he feels things are so dangerous. But then doesn't he use himself in Galatians 1 as a bad example, right? Hey, I was like you. I I was pursuing this wrong way. I was getting a lot of credit for it, but God turned me around. So, we have to remember when Paul critiques false brothers, he's critiquing what he once believed and what he once was.
Yeah, that's a
So,
good point.
so in that sense, he's not, I think what he's saying about them is something he'd say about himself. And then we remember, and every culture is a little different, right? Japanese culture is different from British culture, and American culture is different from Mexico, and so on we could go. So, how you translate the words of the Bible in our cultural specific situation, we always have to think, okay, what message would this send? And which is why God, I think, gave us preachers and teachers.
Yeah.
Because part of what we do when we prepare is we think hard and pray hard and get input from others about how do we communicate this in our cultural moment. So, a lot of cultures in history, and probably, you're Canadian, but I'm American, but Western culture, American culture is very sensitive, right?
Mhm.
Uh, and there's good in that, but also there's bad in it, right? Previous cultures, they were more direct and blunt.
Yeah, I've never
So
thought about that, but you think maybe the Galatian church could take a little more from Paul than we might be able to?
yeah, yeah, yeah. You think of read the debates of the 1500s. Now, I think Calvin and Luther sometimes were too strong, but it was a different cultural moment,
Yeah.
and people, yeah, and there are still cultures today. The South in the United States is less blunt than the Northeast,
Okay.
and I've met people from the South who go to the Northeast of the United States and they feel offended, like, wow, those
Yeah.
people, they're not as friendly, but it's a different culture.
Yeah.
People are more direct up in the Northeast than they are in the South. And so we need to recognize that when we read literature too. There's different registers of how people speak and
Yeah,
write.
that's a really good point. I mean, because again, we read Galatians, I think, whoa, Paul's being strong, but maybe they were just like, yeah, this is just Paul speaking to me. This is,
Well, I do think they thought he was strong,
okay,
but but
but
I
not in
think,
a like my feelings hurt, I'm offended kind of way.
yeah,
Maybe.
right. Our culture is very easily offended.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had mentioned my wife's family's in New York, and they're full Italian, so there is a different bluntness when we go there versus our quiet little Canadian family on the West Coast.
Yeah.
Very,
Yeah.
very different
I
environments.
I can imagine. Yeah.
In Galatians, Paul defends his apostleship. He recounts his conversion. How does his personal testimony shape, if it does, his arguments in this letter?
Well, I think what's happening in chapters 1 and 2, I think the Galatian opponents are questioning Paul's apostolic authority. I think they're questioning the independence of his gospel and the truth of his gospel. So I think Paul tells his story in chapter 1 to say, look, my gospel was independently given to me by Jesus Christ when he appeared to me on the Damascus Road. And he tells the story of how he was advancing in Judaism. He was very zealous for the ancestral traditions. And I think his point there is, look, if because they're saying Paul wants to please people. Paul says, if I wanted to please people, I would have remained in the Jewish circles I was raised in because I was the bright young seminary student. I was the one everybody was saying like, wow, you're awesome. Um, but the only reason I turned around is Jesus appeared to me on the Damascus Road. He called me from my mother's womb. No, he separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace. Those are the exact words. To reveal his son to me on the Damascus Road. So I think what he's saying to the Galatians is, well, yeah, salvation is all of grace. That's what happened to me. God's grace just grabbed me. But I think actually his primary point is you can trust my gospel. And then chapter 2, what does he say? When I went down to Jerusalem with Titus and I met with Peter, James, and John, they did not agree with these teachers who are coming to Galatia and saying you have to be circumcised. No, Peter, James, and John agreed with me and Barnabas. They gave us the right hand of fellowship. They did not think Titus had to be circumcised to be saved. So I think he's saying, look, guys, my gospel is the truth. My gospel is the way it is. And I'm not a renegade apostle. I'm not out there on my own preaching my own gospel. No, Peter, James, and John agree with this gospel. Not only that, how when Peter went astray, I rebuked him. And I think there's every reason to think Peter responded well to the rebuke because
Okay.
otherwise Paul's argument makes no sense. Because if Peter uh, ultimately disagrees with Paul on the gospel, then the previous passage that Peter, James, and John agree is worthless. It's actually a lie because if in 2:11 through 14 if Peter ends up disagreeing with Paul, the agreement in 2:1 through 10 is a charade because when push comes to shove, when it comes down to details, when it comes down to real life, they actually disagree. No, no, no. Paul says Peter was acting hypocritically out of fear, not out of his convictions. So, and of course, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that they all preach the same gospel. So, yeah, the authority of Paul's gospel is, I think, the main point, that the authority, the truth, but it's not just Paul. It's it's the apostolic gospel. It's the gospel they all agree on. And maybe he also brings in Peter. It's just a guess, but maybe he brings in Peter because just to show we can all fall short.
Hmm.
No matter how great you are, you can fall short.
Assuming, like you say, that Peter responded well, Paul is such an example for us in terms of standing up for the gospel and confronting Peter. But then Peter is such an example for us of, to what degree we can again assume that he received it well, that he
Yeah.
did receive a rebuke and responded rightly. Because that would be another place where it'd be in our culture, I think, it'd be really easy to be the offended leader there as Peter.
Yeah. And Paul does say in Galatians 6, so I think he followed this even publicly. When we reprove someone else, do it gently.
Hmm.
Look into yourself, lest you also be tempted. So, I mean, I saw a movie years ago called Peter and Paul. And Riley, I bet you haven't seen this movie because
No,
it's
I
really,
haven't heard of it.
but Anthony Hopkins, if you know
Okay.
that,
Yeah,
he played
absolutely.
Paul when he was young.
Oh, interesting.
But the way they portray it in the movie is they just have Paul screaming at Peter,
Okay.
yelling and screaming really angrily. But of course, none of us were there. But I don't think that's the way it happened. I think Paul publicly but gently reproved him.
Yeah.
And I don't think he was screaming or yelling at him or losing his temper, because I think he followed the very advice he gave in the letter.
Yeah.
Uh, Restore another person with a spirit of gentleness, lest you also be tempted. So I think Paul reproved him. That's hard to do. That takes a lot of courage, right?
Mhm.
Especially when everybody's following Peter.
Yeah.
That takes a lot of courage. And I think Paul showed that courage in that incident.
Just a couple more questions for you, Tom. I don't want to keep you over the hour here, but I mean, I have so many, again, because we're going through Galatians, maybe especially, I
Sure.
have so many questions for you, but Paul's letter played a key role in the Reformation, particularly in Luther's theology, and obviously you would align a lot with that. But I just wonder, does your reading of Galatians does it differ at all from a classical Reformation interpretation? Are there any differences that you would see between your interpretations and Calvin or Luther?
That's a good question. Probably, but nothing I'm thinking of though.
Okay, yeah, nothing that
Yeah, I
stands
mean,
out.
I think I'm basically, I mean, particular verses here and there, of course. I'm
Okay,
not thinking of it. But the general understanding of the gospel, I love Luther's 1535 commentary on Galatians. He did too, right? 1518, 1519. Yeah, I mean, Luther gets off the subject, right? I mean, that's just the way Luther is
yeah.
sometimes. But I mean, I think it's very profound. I mean, Calvin's a very good exegete and interpreter. Um, yeah, I'm not thinking of any particular thing where I disagree. I'm sure if we looked at it verse by verse, I could point out something, but
Are there any other reformers other than Luther and Calvin that maybe don't get thought of as much, but that you've benefited from in terms of their thoughts on Galatians?
no, I mean, look, there are many other reformers who wrote on it, but I haven't spent time
Okay.
in that. Yeah, there's so much there, right? I mean, Bucer, Peter Martyr, Vermigli, and on it goes. But I haven't
Okay.
plumbed those depths.
If you were mentoring a young preacher working through Galatians today, Tom, any advice that you would give on how to communicate its message clearly and effectively?
Well, I think it's always through our own personality, but it's always based first on the biblical text. I would say a preacher who I think expressed well the message of Galatians, so he's worth listening to. Don't try to copy him. We're all different, but I think Tim Keller
Okay.
expresses well what it means and pastorally not to trust in ourselves.
Okay.
I I think Tim's ministry spoke to people powerfully because it was very gospel centered in terms of where do you put your trust. And I
Mhm.
think Tim was good at analyzing in our own hearts where tend to trust in ourselves, right? So, I'm thinking of books like The Prodigal God and things like that. But yeah, he's just very good at that. I mean, obviously others are too.
Mhm.
But I think that's a good place for a young preacher to say, oh, here's a person who understands the message of Galatians, but it was effective at communicating it.
Yeah.
Now, we shouldn't try to copy people. We all have our own personalities, but we can learn. We can learn from them. And of course, I mean, I always want to say, read lots of Luther.
Okay.
Because Luther so struggled with a guilty conscience
Yeah.
and was very sensitive. So I think he speaks very powerfully to people today that are very introspective and sensitive. Um, he experienced it so powerfully, and so that comes through in his writings.
I presented a quote in my sermon last week on 5:16 to 24 from Luther from one portion of his commentary where he talked about he said exactly this. He was like, when I was a monk, and I would feel carnal lust or I would feel this, and I would get so down on myself and being like, this is all in vain. You don't even deserve to be in this ministry. And then he said something to the degree like, I wish at those times I had read Galatians 5:17, because then I would have said, uh, what did he say? But Martin, take heart, don't despair. You have this
Oh,
war within you. You have the flesh still in you.
sure,
God has
sure.
grace for you. It was just like you're saying, it was such a powerful picture because he seemed to be so
Mm,
self-deprecating at some point in his
yeah,
life and ministry.
very, very self-aware.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good word for it. My last question, Tom, and maybe it's a silly one, but I'd be curious to know if you could sit down with the Apostle Paul and ask him one question. Do you have any idea of what you would want to ask him? Wait,
Yeah.
let's say in terms of related to Galatians, maybe, or outside of it.
Yeah, I think I'd want to ask him, how does it kind of what we were just talking about? What does it look like to be justified and have the Spirit? And I think we can up with a good answer today. But if I could ask him, what does it
Yeah.
look like to be justified and have the Spirit and still struggle with sin? What does that look like practically? Tell
Yeah.
me more. I'd love to, I'd love to talk to him about that.
Yeah.
Maybe tell me, Paul, how it worked out in your life. Because
Yeah.
that he doesn't tell us that. So
That's a good question. Again, as I was preaching this last week, we were paralleling a lot to Romans 7, and
yeah,
Paul's struggle
struggle.
there. Uh,
Right,
so
right.
clearly he thought about it a lot. That would
Yes,
that would be a
absolutely.
good question to ask. Well, Tom, I just thank you so much for your time for the conversation. Thank you for this book, Christ Crucified, a Theology of Galatians, and thank you for your work on the series. I'm excited. I think I have a second volume just on the way, and then looking forward to all the subsequent ones as well.
Thank you, Riley. Great talking to you today.
Yeah, you too. Thank you, Tom.